Have you ever wondered what some of our most profound questions around meaning, value, and life, both on a human scale and beyond in the cosmos, could look like? Today, I'm happy to address these questions with my friend and colleague, Andrew Davis. Dr. Andrew Davis is an American process philosopher, theologian, and a scholar of the cosmos. He's an academic and research director for the Center for Process Studies, where he researches, writes, teaches, and organizes conference on various aspects of process and relational thought. He's an advocate of the metaphysics and meaning in a hospitable universe and approaches philosophy as the endeavor to systematically think through what reality must be like because we are a part of it. So Andrew's written like a bunch of really cool books. He's been author, editor, and co-editor of nearly a dozen books, including Mind, Value, and Cosmos, On the Relational Nature of Ultimacy, Process Cosmology, New Integrations in Science and Philosophy, and the book that we will be discussing today, which is the Metaphysics of Exo-Life Toward a Constructive Whiteheadian Cosmology. So, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us here.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, and as we're spitting out terms like Whiteheadian cosmology and metaphysics of exo-life, you might be thinking, what in the world are we even talking about here? And one of my aims in this conversation is to speak through this incredible book and encourage you, if you're somebody who is interested in the questions that we're going to explore, that, hey, you might be able to take a book like this one bite at a time and find that your worldview and indeed your life's trajectory is opened up and changed as a result. Yeah.
I love that. I certainly hope for the same. It is an adventurous book, but I've gotten a lot of fascinating responses and happy that it's being read and the ideas are being wrestled with. I think that's a nice posture with respect to these questions of other worlds, extraterrestrial life. We have to be able to wrestle with them openly. Absolutely.
Yeah, totally, Andrew. I was raised in the buckle of the Bible Belt in the God-haunted, Christ-obsessed American South. And even being raised fundamentalist the way I was in high school, I got way into UFOs and various abduction phenomena, people seemingly across times and cultures having parallel experiences with various classes of being that were really hard to make sense of. And I never knew how to let that hang together with my rather rigid religious beliefs, where such things were usually discounted as out of hand, because after all, did Jesus die to save the Greys or the reptilians or what have you? That was usually the level of discourse that I was raised in when even attempting to reconcile these thoughts. But your life and scholarship has taken you on a world where generally you have a much wider angle on the cosmos.
Yep.
And yet, I think you preserve something of the personalism with which the best of religion wants to insist that we actually matter. And
No, absolutely. But I think we share that background, Mike. I was raised in an evangelical fundamentalist background too. When I always was looking at the heavens, the cosmos to me it's always been just unbelievably beautiful and compelling, mysterious. I didn't ask the kinds of questions about it theologically back then that would surface later in life. But it was 2017 really when I got into this topic in more of a robust way. So I was a grad student in my doctoral program at Claremont School of Theology and was a research and teaching assistant for my professor. And we were researching for a class that he would offer for the first time. And it was religions and exo-life, right? And exo-life we can just think of as a smaller way of expressing extraterrestrial life.
mm-hmm.
And it was really in that time doing research, reading up on just the history, the philosophy, the deep historical backdrop of these conversations that really perked my interest.
Mm-hmm.
So I look back to that time as being where my initial blossoming happened with respect to this discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel like in recent years, the conversation's become a lot more mainstream, whether it's like really bizarre things like Blink-182's Tom DeLonge contracting with the federal government for UAP research to, books like American Cosmic or Supernatural by religion scholar Jeffrey Kripal and UFO abductee Whitley Strieber, which really stretched and challenged my epistemology. And I feel like your book is definitely in this lineage that's asking some questions. So I want to dive right in with some questions that I have for you.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is a very exciting time, as you're insinuating there. And so one of the questions I think we'll probably be getting into is what sort of philosophical undergrowth do we bring to some of this phenomenon? That's an open discussion that's been discussed all throughout history. So I'm in part doing my best to contribute to that conversation, hopefully in a productive and constructive sense.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
absolutely, let's dive in.
Uh-huh. Totally. One of the things that I've noticed through the years is there's definitely a tension oftentimes in the popular discourse between these religious worldviews, like I just sketched the kind that I was raised in, and these sort of, UFO, UAP discourse, which sometimes takes on this sort of reductive materialist lens that very much Carl Sagan cosmos thing is says that we're so insignificant. And
Mm.
I feel like you argue that our physical insignificance in the cosmos doesn't diminish our metaphysical significance. So, could you explain
Yeah.
this paradox for us, especially in light of things like the stunning new James Webb telescope images that do show the true scale of what we've got going on with billions of galaxies?
Absolutely. Yes. So it definitely is part and parcel of the modern scientific world. It's a widely touted claim, right, that we are insignificant. We occupy really no physically special place in the cosmos. Just a bit of history, what's been called the Copernican principle, named after Nicholas Copernicus, the great polymath, really consists in this disruption of a geocentric and indeed an anthropocentric worldview. So we learned, of course, that Earth is not the center of the geocentric universe, but really on the periphery of a much larger heliocentric system. But of course, Hubble and now James Webb have revealed in spectacular form that we're not just a solar system, we're a solar system in a galaxy, and our galaxy is one among billions of galaxies. So I am absolutely just in awe with respect to some of these images. So, inarguably, one might say that these images only add further grounds to our cosmological insignificance.
Mm-hmm.
So or does it? Because I think a lot of, and this is where philosophy comes, a lot of this is based in a certain fallacy against the backdrop of a kind of default nihilism with respect to our place in the universe. So it is the case that we've been cosmologically decentered, I'd say. But to then take that to mean that we are worthless or have no contributing value is, I think, a step too far. So, as you put it, whereas we've been cosmologically decentered, I think we need to metaphysically recenter ourselves
Mm.
because we are an expression of this universe and its deeper rhythms of evolution. And I think taking that seriously recentered us in a way that is not anthropocentric. So, one way I like to say this is that it's not that the universe is anthropocentric, but rather that human beings are anthropocosmic, right? In the sense that we are this expression again of the rhythms of the universe, such that a statement of our significance is not going to be found, I would say, at the end of some telescope. Rather, it's going to be found in attention to our own experiential depths, which are being shined through with what this universe is doing and what it's doing in us. And I think that's a nice way to bring us back into the center, an anthropocosmic center,
Mm.
without saying that it's simply all about us. And perhaps the last thing I'll say is it's not the size that matters after all, right?
Okay.
So we can't make the value claim of significance by virtue of how small we are or our particular location in the universe.
Mm.
Value claim comes with what we are all a part of and what is shining through us. And we are
Mm.
central in that regard. We have to start with our inner experience. It's almost a kind of spiritual starting point, too, isn't it? Attention to our interior depths. So we're cosmologically decentered, but metaphysically we are central and we actually have no way of escaping that.
Mm.
So, what do you think about that? It's a kind of
Yeah.
way of reshifting or inverting that
Yeah.
Copernican idea, you know?
Yeah, yeah, I'm chewing on that. That it reminds me of what evolutionarily informed minister Bruce Sanguin has said. And I think he echoes a
Mm.
lot of others that we are, in a certain sense, the universe becoming conscious of itself. That even if we want to
Yeah,
take an emergentist bottom up view, then the universe, whether it's through some sort of omega point guidance or sheer serendipity, has evolved in us who have
yeah,
this strange ability of self-reflexive consciousness and the ability to reflect on what it is that we see and hopefully value
yeah,
it. I know value is a big theme in your work. Yeah,
very much.
I'll continue to marinate on that, but it sounds like a really promising reframe.
Absolutely. And what I'll just add to that is we're arguably in a meaning crisis, as a lot of folks have been discussing it. And I
Mhm.
think one aspect of the meaning crisis is a belonging crisis, right? the sense of how we belong, not just to, say, our families at a local level or culture, society, but do we fit? How do we fit in the cosmic scheme of things? And I think this is a beautiful way of expressing that belonging, right? Where being and longing come together. It's this expression of the cosmos through us. And the cosmos has to be the way it is for us to exist. And if we didn't belong in a deep sense, we would not exist. That's a claim I'm willing to make. But
Yeah.
I do think it awakens this sense of belonging that is at the source, at least in part, of a lot of the lapse in meaning that we're seeing for any number of reasons culturally.
Yeah, I love that. And I guess your philosophy wouldn't be known as process relational thought if you didn't, in some ways, tie belonging to existence itself. And,
Yeah, absolutely.
it
You
reminds
bet.
me of what I try to do with the more orthodox question mark view of a Trinitarian cosmos. If the way that if the unique inflection of Christianity is to express our flavor of monotheism, oneness of God as relationship, what does that
Hmm.
say about this created order? What does this say about us as persons? Do we, find oneness in both the unique usness of subjectivity, but also the interrelatedness? And
Yeah,
it feels like
absolutely.
you're raising that question on a completely cosmic scale, which is awesome.
Absolutely. That's a great way to put it. Yeah, no, and we've benefited from your good work with Richard Rohr on that and a lot of your writing. So I'll always appreciate
Mhm.
reading your stuff, certainly.
Thank you. Yeah. And to bring this conversation literally crashing down to earth, first I want to define a term in case folks haven't heard it. And that is this idea of UAP, which is unidentified anomalous phenomenon. It's
Hmm.
a more nuanced term that has entered the discourse in recent years, replacing the more clunky and maybe specific but much wider known UFO, unidentified flying object. Just to name that for anyone listening, because there have been these recent congressional hearings on UAPs, and there's even been weird things spotted over New Jersey recently. And so are they drones? Are they from somewhere else? Why is no one really talking about it? Why did we forget about it? Why did it go through a really quick news cycle? Is our life this dire that we forgot about the things in the air in New Jersey? But there have been these recent congressional hearings, and they suggest the
Yeah.
possible retrieval of what they're calling non human biologics. Your book proposes an ontology where mind and experience go all the way down in nature. And you've already alluded to that, but tell us more about how does this framework help us think about potential alien consciousness?
Yeah. Okay. In the language of non-human biologics, that was David Grush, I think, in the, when was this? Only a couple years ago, maybe now, at the congregational hearings. Fascinating stuff. And as you say, there's a lot to deal with. And again, this is where it helps to bring a sort of philosophical framework to the discussion. So I guess in answering, let me say again that we're anthropocosmic expressions of this universe, right? In some sense, the nature and character of the universe hibernates within us and shines through us. And I just don't think there's any way to get around that. But what that means, I think, is that the universe not only harbored the possibility of experience, but also labored it into being in creatures like us. And what this suggests, at least at one level, is that experience has a much more fundamental place. So, in contrast, we might say that if the universe is made of pulpy, dead matter, it's not at all obvious that it would give birth to creatures like you and I.
Mhm.
And that's just an intuitive claim. So it might like the widest application of what has been called, the hard problem of mind or experience or consciousness. So as for me, I'm simply unwilling to let go of my continuity with the universe. I think we have to ask that, given that experience doesn't magically appear all of a sudden in us, then there must be a continuum of experience in some sense across nature. And so we can ask the question imaginatively, how far down does experience go? And at least for the process tradition, which is my home tradition, experience goes all the way down in nature. And this is what David Griffin has called famously panexperientialism. Far from a pulpy dead matter, there's a variety of proposals today that are saying that mind or experience pervades the universe and is not just an afterthought, right? No point intended. But we are seeing the emergence of a post-materialistic universe. And at least for Whitehead, at least for process thinkers, what is fundamental is much more of an energetic event of experience, right? And the high evolutionary expression of that is something we find in our conscious states. But what does it mean for extraterrestrial minds? I'd say if mind belongs to nature, right? If in some sense mind is ingredient in evolution, then we should expect to find expressions of this mind in a variety of different ways. and in ways that are perhaps akin to ours, but we should potentially expect far surpassing ours as well. So it's this extension of fact, if mind is in our ontology, as it were, right? Then mind is beyond Earth. And the extent is to what evolutionary height is that mind there?
Mhm.
And I guess the last thing I'll say is we're at a time where the dismissal of perspectives like this is no longer really possible. So we have all these varieties of panpsychism, of panexperientialism that are emerging. And I think it's important for us to apply the implications of those philosophical perspectives beyond Earth and see what sort of fruitful things we can accomplish. So exophilosophy as a certain emergent field is doing that. Exotheology in part is doing that. And I think the process tradition can assist in doing that too. And in part, that's what I'm trying to further.
Yeah, I love that as I'm thinking through what you're saying along the history of ideas and the way that they impact how we view life. It seems like the sort of materialist world that has often been the sort of Enlightenment inheritance, at least in mainstream scientific discourse, in some ways is an outgrowth of, I would say, specifically Protestant Christianity and the ways in which we have viewed monotheism that has led to a disenchanted world. And
Mhm.
in some ways, what you're describing is this more robust kind of panpsychist world, a re-enchanted world, reminds me in certain respects of animism as a primordial
Yeah,
belief that all of humanity shared, and that I think a lot of people of Christian faith and Jewish faith don't realize that even a lot of our own scripture reflects this viewpoint more, and then what we would then later call a sort of bloodless monotheism, that we had
right.
theism for the longest time, a world full of gods, a world full of creatures and intermediaries and enchantments and monsters. There's a lot of interesting biblical
Yeah,
scholarship happening these days about the monstrous and the strange in the world of scripture,
sure.
things that tend to get cleaned up and sanitized. But as we, not saying that your project is exactly this, but it does seem as though maybe we're coming full circle to a kind of integration. And maybe
Mhm.
in some ways the mystics led the way, because another more fully enchanted view of monotheism can be, I remember reading about a dozen years ago, this Jewish rabbi, lawyer, journalist, and Buddhist meditation teacher wrote a book called Everything is God about non-dual Judaism. And he
Mhm.
mentioned that one strand of Kabbalah is to read the Shema, to read the confession, I am the Lord your God, there is no other, in an
Yeah,
absolute sense. Okay. We are all awash in God. We're all awash in Godness, which can both lend itself really well to empirical experimentation, the best of Enlightenment rationalism, but also saying, hey, like everything is actually infused with some level of being, some level of consciousness. And what you're describing is this more cosmocentric vision that nonetheless is us having the vision, to me has a kind of epistemic humility in it, because as we acknowledge that maybe some of this supposedly extraterrestrial life could be more advanced than ours, we might not be at the very top of the chain of being. And maybe religious folks have always said, sure, angels, exalted ancestors, saints, whatever, they're more than us. But to say that these other forms of more than human or non-human life could also
yeah.
be advanced, it's a very humbling proposition.
Yeah, beautifully put, and I couldn't agree more. It is humbling, and we should be very careful about saying we're the cream of the crop at the top. But I wanted to come back on something you said there, and that's about the wider sort of evolution of ideas across history. And there's obviously wonderful work done by Hans Jonas and Robert Rosen on life and the philosophy of life. And one of the points they make in some of their respective work is that for the ancient world, for the antique world, it was just taken for granted that life pervaded the universe, right? Life was a sort of given, and death was a problem. It's obvious that everything is enlivened, active, vital, and so why do we die? And when they tell the story, the emergence of modern cosmology, modern philosophy inverted this. So it became the default that the ontology of death is the default. And
Wow.
so life now becomes the problem. And what I think we're witnessing now, and what I'm trying to at least in part contribute to, is the return to this more lively, vital perspective where life, although we have all sorts of definitions for it, life does not evolve from a ultimately lifeless universe, right? And this is a logical claim, philosophically, we might say, but it's just difficult to imagine if death is the default state, how even one case of life would ever emerge, right? So again, we're returning to the wisdom of the ancients in a certain way, although we're doing it with the facilitation of modern science, human experience again, but a lot of this data is pointing back to an utterly living ontology. And I think in part that's what Whitehead and process thinkers are pointing to. At least that's one of the ways that I would put
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of your book, Metaphysics of Exo-Life, is a kind of extended dialogue with this astronomer and former NASA historian, Stephen J. Dick.
it.
And
Yeah.
he looks at a
Yeah.
lot of the same data that you do. He proposes a kind of naturalistic cosmotheology that
Hmm.
essentially negates God. Whereas you argue for something that you call like a deeper theological realism. So, how do you navigate between these positions while maintaining scientific credibility?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, Dick is a friend. He's doing great work, and his project of naturalistic cosmotheology, as he states it, is really based in a rejection of anthropocentrism on the one hand and supernaturalism on the other. So, I fully agree with his rejection of a theological anthropocentrism, right? I think to the extent that theology remains unduly fixated on human beings alone or our planet alone, then it does suffer disconnection and largely irrelevance right to the wider cosmological landscape we've been discovering, the landscape out of which we've emerged, and only recently, by the way, in terms of cosmic timescales. So I do think if we speak of God, and I think it's appropriate to do, we have to enlarge our portrait of God to match really the magnitude of the universe, to match the magnitude and adventure of cosmological evolution. So again, I'd say we are an anthropocosmic, but not an anthropocentric part of this whole scenario. So in part, I agree with Dick about rejecting anthropocentrism, although I think he can underplay the fact that we are also anthropocosmic expressions and therefore revelatory in deep sense of these deeper principles that we have to also pay attention to. But I mentioned supernaturalism too, so let me just say something about that. So for Dick, a rejection of supernaturalism means a rejection of any and all divine existence. Whereas for myself, for Whitehead, for a number of process thinkers, a rejection of supernaturalism is only a rejection that the divine reality acts in certain supernatural ways, for example, interrupting from the outside the regularities of nature. So I think maybe one way I'd put it is I reject the super in this sense, but not the naturalism or the theism. So I think one critique leveraged at Dick is his naturalistic cosmotheology really is not a theology at all because God
Right.
has been ontologically negated. So I think we can affirm the reality of God. We can do so naturalistically. And what that means is that the reality of God, the activity of God is part and parcel of the normal causal regulations of the world. It's not from up above breaking in, it's welling up from underneath and it's already everywhere entangled. It's not a interrupting God. So when Dick negates God completely, I think he does suffer some challenging philosophical problems. I try to raise those at least in part for the book. But let me also get to because you asked about scientific credibility
Yeah.
and who decides this, right? So
Oh,
this
yeah.
is a really important question.
It's true.
So I think where science presupposes fundamental philosophical questions, as it certainly does, there's really no experiment scientifically, right, you can perform that's going to give you an answer. Rather, philosophy is required, and potentially even theology is required to, I think, answer some of these deepest questions about not only why the universe should be possible, but why it's actual at all. But one fun thing that Dick does do is leave open the possibility for an evolutionary advanced superintelligence, right? A superintelligence that's an outcome, a contingent outcome upon cosmological evolution. And I really like that idea. I'm all for it.
Mhm.
But the move he then makes, and not just him, but Nick Bostrom and others have said this evolutionary superintelligence would have all the same attributes as the traditional understanding of God, right? The different
Right.
omnis, et cetera.
Yep.
And that may be the case to a certain extent, but I think there's one big exception, which I bring up in the book. And the difference is that whereas a superintelligence is a contingent outcome of cosmological evolution rather than its necessary ground and condition, right? The traditional affirmation of God is pointing to that ground and saying
Hmm.
the reality of God is that it has a necessary metaphysical function without which there cannot be any contingent achievements whatsoever.
Yes.
So it doesn't quite solve the problems that
Yeah.
God in principle has resolved. And I play with Dick creatively in that regard.
Yes. Yeah. It's such an interesting question about that, the sort of, yeah, emergentist view that might have a super intelligence as the culmination. Maybe that even sometimes these questions are above my pay grade, but sometimes when y'all process folk talk about God as event or God as becoming, I do imagine that you see God as the sort of cumulative outcome, whereas more traditional metaphysics says that no, there's actually a priority of mind or a priority of being before there can be a manifest universe. And sometimes this might be overly simplistic and it's already been thought to death, but I think, what if it could somehow be both? What if
Yeah.
just we are more than the sum total of our parts, and yet somehow it might seem like the assemblage of our parts either generates or creates the conditions to tune into some deeper form of being? What if the same could
Yeah.
be said about the cosmos and God being like the reality or the soul of all that exists? And if that's the case, could there be like a time loop going on? Could there be, there is this
Yeah.
thing, and if time is more immutable, which is what physics for the last century has proposed, then isn't it possible that somehow what is emergent from everything could then manifest everything? I don't know.
No, I think that's the right question to ask. And process thinkers would love the way you frame that, because we don't like to think of things in terms of either or, right? God is either behind all of creation or the outcome of it. So either behind or up ahead.
Mm,
And for Whitehead, for process thinkers, it is actually both in this sense. So he has a dipolar understanding of God. And what that means is that God has a divine mental pole, what he calls the primordial nature, which is the ground of all possibilities that the universe strives for. So this would be, in a sense, God is the ground of being, God in back of the entire evolutionary process. But
mhm,
that's not all that. God is also up ahead of the process. So he speaks of the consequent nature, the physical pole of God, as this receptive dimension of the life of God that's taking in everything that evolution has achieved for good or ill and transforming it in a deep sense, then offering it back to the world.
mm,
That's a sort of poetic way to put it, but God is up ahead and also behind. And
mhm.
so this sort of both that you're talking about is something I think that we consciously try to affirm for certain philosophical reasons as well. So I think you can have both, but you
Mhm.
have to articulate it carefully.
Yeah, and I guess, is it the careful articulation where there ends up being so much disagreement? Because in a way, what you just described
Yeah,
doesn't feel that different than the biblical formulation of I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, or yeah, classical theist ideas of God pervading time, yet somehow being
yeah,
outside of time. I know sometimes process folks quibble with the idea of outside of time as being a nonsense statement, because how do we even
hmm
know if time is space or inherent properties that we dwell within? But then we get into questions of revelation and mystery and all that jazz.
sure. But I think the alpha omega language can absolutely fit. We have to explain it the way in which it does. Not that we're wedded completely to Whitehead's thought, although he's been the most influential for me, but he also speaks of God in that sense, the beginning and the end of every event. The beginning needs a possibility to get started, and the end needs preservation to finally be finished. And God is the starting and the preservation of every event in the cosmos.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it's wonderful, really. I think it holds a lot of ways. The both and understanding of God's nature and function affords a lot of possibilities for thinking about a number of these things,
Mhm.
including intelligent extraterrestrials. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I want to get back to the Exolife in a moment, but while we're in this
Yeah,
cul-de-sac, I feel like
yeah,
I have an interesting pull in the company I keep and even like my life and practice. On the one hand, I hang out and talk to process folks like yourself, like Trip Fuller, like Tom Ord, who have this beautiful and poetic articulation that even hyphenate, you call it process relational theology, and you speak of this idea of God beautifully working with all of the glories and the tragedies of the human experience, of the cosmic experience of evolution. But then you go and make statements like, but God does not intervene in otherwise naturalistic processes. And so on the
mm,
other hand, I come from like a Pentecostal background. I am
yeah,
friends with even post deconstructive Pentecostals and mystics and even magicians, magical practitioners, energy healers. And your vision of science, by some accounts, isn't, because it's not strictly materialist, you do flirt with panpsychism and people doing experiments on psi phenomenon, which could include intuitive flashes of knowing that are non-localized between two or more humans or non-human entities. And it
yeah,
reminds me of what in the Pentecostal world we grew up with, we talked about using Paul's language in Corinthians, these spiritual gifts of words of wisdom or words of knowledge. So, where do you draw the line between what you consider to be intervention and what could simply
Hmm.
be a far stranger world of cosmic entanglement that sometimes does seem to lead to spontaneous healings, sometimes leads to various knowings that are not currently explainable? Like, I get from a theodicy perspective why it's a much
Yeah.
neater and tidier thing to say, look, we don't honestly have any reckoning for why this might allegedly sometimes happen and other times not. So it's easier to say, as Tom Ord does, God can't, rather than
Right.
that God or spirit sometimes seems to, according to the indigenous beliefs of billions of people throughout history, according to the experiences of many people in the current day, but also we see outright manipulation, lies,
Yeah.
wishful thinking, confirmation bias. And so sometimes it seems to me that folks on your side of the aisle, it's like more elegant to just say, none of that stuff is possible. But then y'all do
Right. Right.
have this sort of interesting overlap around psi phenomenon stuff. So what do you think
Yeah.
about
Great.
all that?
I think those are very important points. Yeah. And our side of the aisle, certainly. Yeah. Tom should write a theology of psi phenomena. So let me just say, I agree with you. I believe and want the world to be much more strange. And I think it is that way. And I think if anyone who begins to read Kriptal's work, Pasulka's work, you begin to see the range of anomalous, call it what you want, phenomena that is a reality for a number of people. And so this has been a serious, taking this phenomena seriously has been a part of the process tradition. David Griffin, if anyone's interested, I think it's a 1997 or 8 book called Parapsychology, Philosophy, and Spirituality. And this is a landmark book for the process tradition where he's taking all of this very seriously. And so I want to do the same. And I don't want to arbitrarily say, well, that's too difficult and we need to solve theodicy so God doesn't intervene. So I think it's not the case that God doesn't intervene. God intervenes constantly. That's what's going on. But when we think of intervention, it's not from up there, out there. It's not from the outside in. It's
Yeah.
much more radiating from without. So for Whitehead, at least, no single event at the very base of reality can even get started without the intervention, as it were, of God, without God's provision of a possibility for it, what he called the initial aim. So I think I can understand the wanting to say God can't and reject the intervening style. We have to be careful about how we understand what that means. But I really think that intervention is happening all the time. But that's probably not the right word because it gives people sort of the wrong idea. And
Mm-hmm.
who knows what that allows when it comes to indigenous wisdom, spirituality, etc. It's clear that in an experiential universe, all these possibilities open up, arguably in a way that was not available for a reductive materialist universe. It's partly why they've been so keen on rejecting or dismissing this sort of phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
But all you need is one right white crow, as Griffin argued, to show you that not all crows are black. And arguably, we have white crows abounding when it comes to this phenomena. And it's an opportunity for theologians, philosophers to think about understandings of God that are much more wild in nature. And so I'm a fan of that and don't want to arbitrarily limit what's possible theologically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And yeah, and it really resonates. The occult journalist Mitch Horowitz has done a good job documenting that when psi experiments have been sponsored by universities, they do end up demonstrating more than mathematically probable incidences of psi phenomenon. And his argument is that the reason why that's not more widely known is because those universities tend to be embarrassed about their own results and they're just underfunded. There's just not a lot of
Yeah.
attention that gets placed on how strange the universe might be. But you're right. People like
Yeah.
Jeffrey Kripal and others have documented that, yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff out there, both in terms of traditional beliefs and in terms of what we can sometimes replicate in a lab setting, even though a lab setting
Hmm.
might not
Hmm.
be the ideal space to experience a lot of what traditional cultures might experience in healing spaces, ecstatic, prophetic spaces, etc. So it's cool to hear that there is room in the process tradition to grapple with these things. I'm sure not just capitulating in an overcredulous way, but nonetheless saying,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a weird world out there. And what you're saying is it's a weird world in here. Maybe it is
Yeah.
dimensional instead of out there, that maybe the ancient worldviews did tend to have a multi-tiered universe, did tend to conceive
Hmm.
of God as being somewhere beyond the canopy of the stars. Now
Right.
we know better, but knowing better ought not lead to what C.S. Lewis called the chronological snobbery of thinking that whatever the current paradigm is is inherently wiser. And Kreipel and Strieber in their book, The Supernatural, and they separate those words because they are also trying
Yeah,
to redefine what that means. Just make the case like, why is it that we do have all of these like very uniform abduction experiences across eras and cultures, yet things like SETI, et cetera, do tend to come up short on out there validation. So could what's
yeah,
happening
yeah.
be a more interior or interdimensional experience of something bubbling from within? I
Sure,
think
sure.
these are all
No,
good questions.
yeah, it's such an exciting time, and it is interesting that SETI and METI enthusiasts are often they can be dismissive of some of the abduction phenomena, and rightfully so, nobody wants to be taken for.
Right.
But yeah, it's so there has been a distinction between extraterrestrials that are out there, truly other life of different kinds, different planets, and ultra-terrestrials, right? James Madden, for example, in his great book called Unidentified Flying Hyperobjects, argues that perhaps what we're dealing with is not so much extraterrestrial, but ultra-terrestrial, and that the way in which human perception has evolved simply does not allow us to see outside of certain bounds that make our conscious experience possible. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things, as it were, outside of what our perception allows that, for whatever reason, break into that perception in ways that are shocking and mysterious to us. So that distinction is important because this is not a settled issue, and it may be that our perception has evolved in such a way that leaves much out. In fact, we know that's the case, at least in part. You know.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And one thing I've really appreciated about Whitley Strieber is his own sort of brutal honesty and even skepticism about his own experiences. I have been experiencing these things for decades. I've not drawn any hard and fast conclusions about whether they are out there in here. But one thing he names is that sometimes in the abduction community, in an effort to gain more scientific purchase and credibility, people tend to limit their reports to, oh, I saw these grays with the almond eyes, or I saw these green men. When in
Mhm.
reality, the experiences that a lot of people have, even in the modern day, involve things like gnomes and elves and like mythical creatures. And if we're like really honest, there's like a whole lot of weird stuff happening that can make it more easily dismissible. But also,
Yeah.
if we're being honest to the phenomenology, there's a range of things that are being experienced by folks.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is all a part of the influx of energy surrounding this topic. There's really some great work happening on it. So all we can do is do our best to be rigorous with our thinking and stay to the data and not dismiss our experience. I think that's what the process tradition would require is
Mhm.
we have to be open and not be narrowly selective in our data,
Yeah.
even if that makes our worldviews a bit harder. Right. And if need be, we need to widen our worldviews. We need to say that we have enough data to say that certain ways of viewing the world that are, hitherto dominant actually need to change. And that's back to my post-materialistic world idea,
Yeah.
where we're starting to see how strange the universe really is. It's an exciting time for me.
Yeah.
I like it. It's a cool time to be alive, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. Getting back to your book more centrally, in light of some of the recent, testimony of military folks around UAPs, around military installations, how does your concept of aesthetic value in the universe help us think about potential alien ethics and intentions?
Yes. Okay. So, yeah, the question of ethics in this discussion is super important, and there's again lots and lots being written on this: astro policy, astro ethics, cosmocentric ethics. There's all these exoaxiologies, I'm calling it, in a new project, but there's all these different approaches to thinking about what really is raising the larger question of value in the universe as such. What is this place of value? So, at least for myself, for the process tradition, it's aesthetic value. That is the widest and most inclusive form of value that's really applicable to the universe at all scales and levels. So, to recall one of Whitehead's statements, he says, it's not the case that we just happen to have a world that expresses any random order. He says, we have a world because there is a more fundamental order.
Mm.
And all order, he says, is aesthetic order, right? In the sense that it's based in principles of harmony, of regularity, intensity. And without those principles, we wouldn't have a world. So arguably, we do not impose those principles on the universe. Rather, they are disclosed in our experience. They're embodied in the universe. They're embodied in ourselves, again, as remarkable displays of order and intensity. In fact, Charles Hartshorne, who was Whitehead's assistant for a time, and Hartshorne would go on to be one of the principal names behind process theology, he once said, and I'll just paraphrase here, but he said, yeah, the principles of harmony and intensity are more ultimate than the laws of nature and the reason for there being any natural laws.
Mm.
So at a base level, and we're going to get to the ethics, but at a base level, it seems that aesthetic value, at a very minimum, pervades the world and is a part of the fabric, in some sense, the potentiality fabric of the universe. But what about ethical and moral value? And this is important. We have to bring it in. So I think on an evolutionary conception like this, we can see moral value and moral order dawning out of more fundamental aesthetic domains of order. And that moral order, in some sense, seems to dawn with the advent of higher complex consciousness, even meta consciousness, right? But I guess the larger point is we have aesthetic and moral order as a part of our experience in this universe. And we might even say that values are the content of experience. Values are what experience or consciousness is, in a deep sense, aware of. So I just think that if we extend it now to extraterrestrials and ask, will our morality or aesthetics map onto theirs, that's going to be a hard question about the commonality between us and them. And again, the literature is so vast on this.
Yeah.
And of course, there's no simple answer. But if we're willing to say, as I am, that truth, beauty, and goodness, values like these are not, confined to Earth, then we should expect to find them embodied beyond Earth, right? In the form, say, of planetary integrity at an aesthetic level, or moral integrity at a level of conscious beings grappling with the good and the beautiful. So I don't think it'd mean that our morality and art maps onto theirs, right, any more than it would, say, the culture next door. But there would be commonality, there would be overlap, and certainly uniqueness. And so should we come in contact imaginatively with other beings, I think prioritizing and getting a grip on these common elements of value, I think that should be the name of the game.
Mm. Yeah, we might even start with our own terrestrial cultures and doing that.
We're clearly struggling with that already.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, it's such an interesting question. If we were able to have that sort of external cultural contact with an extraterrestrial culture, it would be maybe one of the ultimate reality tests of this kind of a vision, because the idea that value and aesthetics, that truth, goodness, and beauty might be like inherent properties of the universe that can be discovered flies in the face of a lot of the more sort of postmodern masters of suspicion, deconstructive hermeneutics that have held sway for the last several decades and in many quarters, that says that any meaning is contrived and then mutually agreed upon. And as someone who doesn't like math, isn't good at math, like that's what I want to believe. But it blew my mind when higher math opponents are like, yeah, no, mathematical principles aren't so much like made up by us as they're discovered. I'm like, what are you talking about? But yeah, it's an interesting idea.
No, very much. And the philosophical tradition, by and large, has said that the same domain that you're pointing to about the reality of math is discovered is also a domain of qualitative values, right? It's like the return of a certain kind of Platonic conception of the world. It's not just an exegesis of Plato. Yeah, but absolutely. You have a lot of physicists who are saying, no, we discover the world as mathematically structured, right? And if we're able to discover the intelligibility of the world as given mathematically, what other ways are we able to discover the fabric of the universe? And value would be another domain of that realm, as it were, that speaks to what this cosmos in some sense is about, or what it could be about, with the evolution of life in mind. So I just think the masters of sufficient are great. I love reading Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, all these guys, but I don't like the idea that, meaning is just contrived and this and that, because what that does is, again, inappropriately make us exceptions rather than exemplifications of what this universe is doing, right? You're just making up truth, beauty, and goodness, and I'm enjoying truth, beauty, and goodness, but where else does it come from? It comes from the universe, right? Where else can it come from? It's not like it just falls from somewhere else. Meaning is a part of the universe, and it's a part of experience, as long as you refuse to see human beings as separate. We're an expression, anthropocosmically, of deeper rhythms of value that are a reality and not just a useful fiction. At least that would be my approach.
Yeah, it gives me a lot to chew on about how we govern human relations, because I would say that when I was an undergrad, I pretty heavily imbibed, like particularly an anthropology teacher who, from her perspective, was like, every culture is its own thing, and there's so much alterity that there is nothing by which we can judge one another. And
Mm,
where she took that was, hey, if you're in a culture where the husband dies and then the wife like throws herself on the pyre to be immolated, we don't have ethical ground to stand on to say that is not an appropriate practice, even if we think it goes against our feminism, even if we think it goes against all of these things. And she took a really hard line with that, and critiqued
yep.
a lot of this sort of classical anthropology project and conflated it with like colonialist missionary projects as like an attempt
Mm,
to impose arbitrary values of one culture onto another, saying that it was triumphalistic and that it was no good. And of course, a lot of that critique is ethically salient about the ways that we tend to run
yeah.
roughshod over other cultures. But at the same time, her perspective makes it really hard to have something like a UN Declaration of Universal Human Rights. Because
Yeah.
it's who decides what's universal. But religions have often insisted that there is this idea of revelation that's somewhat analogous to what you're describing. It's like the higher math, that maybe there's actually something out there to discover rather than it's simply of our own invention.
Yeah. And it wouldn't necessarily be out there as if at the end of a telescope, but in here again. So
Yeah,
redirecting to our
true. Yeah, that's right.
but
Right.
but you're making a really great point. And this is it's almost a relativistic claim value wise that's often touted. And I'm all for anthropology. They should also study philosophy. So just to speak to the Whitehead and the process tradition, what I'm not saying is that there has to be some rigid and obvious codification of morality or aesthetics in the universe, right? The way in which other extraterrestrials confront and interpret rather and express the good is going to be perhaps different than us, just like it is in India and Chennai or Bangladesh or something. So cultures are going to endlessly disagree perhaps about the precise matters of ethics, aesthetics, and morality, but that there's a difference between, say, better and worse, or beautiful and ugly, perhaps, right?
Mhm.
Arguably is inevitably presupposed, and it's that presupposed standard of difference between value claims um, that I think is pointing to us culturally, philosophically, metaphysically to a standard of value that's in the universe.
Hmm.
And I think we need to take that very seriously, but it's not as if we're all going to agree on things. Agreement has never been the criterion for there being a universal moral or objective moral reality. The difference between better and worse in part has. So we have to get back to that, I think, in some sense. But that's a much larger tangent in some ways.
It is. In some ways, that ties into our conversation because I see what you're describing in a way is we can use this possibility of extraterrestrial contact as this invitation to become planetary citizens that can potentially then become cosmic citizens, which requires a clarification of values. And it makes me think of
Yeah.
this idea that the Academy hates, but has had a lot of currency in popular culture from the Renaissance on. And that's the idea that there is this perennial philosophy, or there's this underlying unity of global religions and spiritualities. And in the
Mm.
past, sometimes these expressions of this inner esoteric value has been the great chain of being. This idea that there is this sort of cosmic harmony that we can find our place in. And in your book, you tweak that a bit and you talk about the great
Mm.
chain of being and becoming in the cosmos.
Right.
And so I'm curious how you might think that this great chain of being and becoming might help us to prepare ethically and philosophically to become planetary citizens on our way to becoming cosmic citizens. How would it help for potential contact with
Yeah.
cultures and tribes far more advanced than our own?
Yeah. Okay. That's a great question. And of course, yeah, the great chain of being, as you said, there is an ancient concept. In a deep sense, we're part of this great chain of being and becoming, and that becoming element would want to emphasize the fact that it's not fixed, it's unsettled, it's unfolding in a deep and abiding way. And arguably the values, I'd say, that we find, expressed along this chain are clues as to the values which find expressions higher and potentially lower than this chain. So there's, again, it's a metaphysical question to say that there's something common to all beings in the universe. And pointing to that commonality is, again, something that is going to be a challenge, but it's what connects us to the great chain of being together. And we have to, I think, do our best to identify that. But one playful way I like to do this when I'm speaking is to say that if there's even one living experience elsewhere in the universe, okay, and there likely are many, then we are extraterrestrials
Mm.
on this planet, and we're examples of extraterrestrials, or at least what they can be like. So we're examples of what could emerge along the great chain of being and becoming. And so, at least from a process perspective, experience, value, becoming, okay, these are fundamental features of the great chain and are going to find expression at different intensities throughout it. So, as for the question about how we prepare for contact, there's a lot written on this, but I think we have to employ first what Whitehead calls imaginative generalization, right? We imaginatively generalize our experience to different domains of the cosmos in an attempt to try to find those commonalities in some sense, those value commonalities. Other beings that will have an interest in living, right? Because life itself is a presupposed value, and potentially also an interest in the different manifold of values, whether rational values of mathematical truth or aesthetic values of art. I just think we have to begin with this imaginative dimension in the form of preparation, because this is new territory.
Mm. Mm.
And it's hard to say exactly what should be done. And like, I recently watched the movie Contact, which is a great film, Jodie Foster. And there's this question about who represents human beings, who represents humanity.
Mhm.
Supposing we could send one of us to meet other civilization, other intelligences, is it going to be an atheist scientist? Will it be an anthropologist, an engineer, or will it be somebody like Gandhi or the Dalai Lama, somebody with a spiritual sense of value? And that's a really fun debate.
Mhm.
Whatever the case, I think that again we're expressions of the chain, and we should imaginatively seek those commonalities, as difficult as that might be.
Mm. Yeah, and as being representatives of the chain, as perhaps preparing ourselves for a kind of planetary belonging, let's talk about transparency. Because I feel like right
Yeah.
now, as we're recording this, America is entering a new intensification of a certain political era, a certain political mood that is reflective of other more authoritarian regimes around the world that seem to purposefully take an extreme postmodern view of reality. Like the name of the game
Mm.
is constantly lying, lots of misinformation, lots of propaganda, not so much so that any one lie will be sincerely believed, but maybe so that we can throw up our hands and say, who even knows what is
Yeah.
real? There's a kind of politics of despair at work. And folks in the UAP world, people who have had abduction experiences, it's a common part of this worldview that can sometimes veer into conspiratorial extremes that there's a lot of cover up that happens. And nonetheless, there does seem to be this historic lack of transparency about the weirder, stranger phenomena of life, so that it's difficult to even find a place of maybe truly receiving these emergent properties of what is. And in Metaphysics of Exo-Life, you talk about how truth and meaning do require this kind of cosmic consciousness. So,
Mm.
with these recent hearings that do start to hint at some government disclosure of UAP programs or interfaces with these phenomena, how might your framework help us think through disclosure and transparency?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, great question. Let me start with the cosmic consciousness bit first, and this is the nerdy part. So it's a metaphysical or arguably a theological point, namely that there is something in the nature of things that ultimately distinguishes the was from the might have been, right? And another way we might put that, or to say, if there wasn't something that distinguished what was from what could have been, right? Alternative futures, then we arguably wouldn't have a capital T truth that is a part of the unfolding of cosmic and terrestrial history. It's a problem when we have nothing but finite conflicting truths, because who's to say any of them bear the sort of weight of the capital T truth that actually we all want at a certain level. Another way to put this is that there's something that accounts for the objectivity of the past as settled fact, right? The past perishes into something and is settled, and it's not you or me that settles that account, right? No one has the absolute width of experience or inclusion to account for the truths, the many truths of the universe in one sort of harmony. Now, arguably, this would be something that only a divine mind could do in some sense. And so Whitehead actually calls it, I mentioned the consequent nature, but again, he calls it the consequent nature as the mind of the universe. So
Mm.
It's God as the ground of truth and meaning. It's the reality of the world as perished into God and preserved there everlastingly, such that God is the distinction between what was and what might have been. Or on the meaning bit, the preservation of the values that were achieved. It'll be a leap now to jump to the current discussion, the crisis of truth. But I think
Mhm.
from a terrestrial perspective, and speaking of value, in the first place, truth is an intrinsic value, right? And we should make no mistake about it. It's like we want the truth and not falsehood. And part of our crisis now is that we do not know how to distinguish truth from falsehood in a deep sense.
Mhm.
So I think that, to the extent that governments do hold deeper truths about UAP phenomenon, we should hope that the truth is what is given to us and not falsehood. But arguably, there's a lot you can know about this phenomena independent of government labels, government agencies. As you're pointing to, there's so much personal experience and wonderful books written where we can take this content seriously independent of a government kind of label. And maybe that's where we should start. Maybe we should remain skeptical of the government claims. So as Pilate asked of Jesus, we should ask of the UAP context, it's what is truth in this context?
Mhm.
And we haven't settled that. But I do think we need a ground for there being truth, right? Truth itself is a philosophical question, philosophical problem, arguably, the settled past. What accounts for it? It's certainly not me or you.
Mhm.
It's something else in the nature of things. And that might be a place to start, right? Truth is something we presuppose, and it is a value that we have to uphold, arguably a religious and scientific value that we have to uphold. And navigating the question with respect to this phenomenon remains difficult, and it's not obvious what we're supposed to do. What do you think about this whole question of truth and falsehood? It's hard.
It's hard. And I do think that the masters of suspicion and the people who deconstruct because we love have brought so much of value to questioning our certitudes. But I do think that these have also been sometimes deliberately manipulated by bad
Yeah.
faith actors. And for years now, we've had robot farms spreading misinformation. Now we have AI that can do it even quicker with
Yep.
deep fakes and so many other things. And it reminds me of certain, not only traditional religious teachers who speak of the idea of revelation or objective truth, but even interspiritual philosophers like G.I. Gurdjieff or Ken Wilber in more recent times who
Yeah.
do dare to speak of objective consciousness and objective art in ways that sometimes have made me feel uncomfortable. But you've really got me
Hmm.
thinking about, yeah, what are the ways in which reality is and is ready to be discovered, and how do we maybe polish the lenses of our own perception, that perhaps we cannot have the complete mind of God or ultimacy in any given thing, of course not.
Yeah.
But how do we have both epistemic humility while also being open to the possibility that there really is a there or a there here to discover? And it feels like that might actually be the call for our spiritual and planetary survival in the days ahead.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think of your statements there, Martin Buber's the I thou relationship, right? And
Mhm.
how this is so important when we extend it cosmologically. Are we dealing with an it or a you out there? Does reality have an identity?
Mhm.
This is a cool way to put it. We know reality has produced identities because we're an example of that in some sense.
Yes.
But it may be profitable for us to extend that and say reality perhaps wouldn't produce anything less than what itself already expressed, right?
Yeah.
And so if reality has an identity, this immediately opens up so many different possibilities in this discussion. It talks about a character, right? A certain in religious experience, this intuition of a character of permanent rightness, he says, where you can discern it somewhat like you discern the characters of your friends, he says. Almost like there's a divine friend at the heart of reality.
Mm.
And I just think that all this crisis of truth, these deep fakes, as you mentioned, all the this is truth only becomes more and more necessary as we see how fleeting it is. We don't know where to stand. But it's not as if we're going back from all the AI things, right? This is
Yeah.
we're only going forward for better or worse, and we have to find a way to navigate this. And I think we haven't found the right way yet. This is a part of many different conversations, from the election to this phenomena to just basic writing of papers and not plagiarizing. ChatGPT is complicating everything, for
Yes.
better or worse.
Yeah.
There's no easy solutions here.
No, it's a lot to chew on, and yet I do think that this sort of emergent fields like what you're involved in, as well as the best and wisest voices of our traditional spiritual paths, can provide us potential stories, practices, community forms, ways of knowing that will maybe lead us on surer footing and also a more wonder-filled perspective.
That's my hope, Mike, and I hope to participate in that and
Yeah.
produce, that as well. So that's my desire.
Absolutely. And I think that we can go on talking forever. That might be a good place as any to bring this in for a landing. So,
Yeah.
Andrew, besides reading the Metaphysics of Exo-Life, which I hope everyone who has listened and wants to take this conversation deeper will pick up a copy. And how else can folks connect with you and your ongoing work?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely, Mike. And thanks for the conversation. If you go to andrewmdavis.info, you can stay up to date on my work. You can subscribe there, and I keep you posted on everything. You can subscribe on my YouTube channel as well, which I keep populated with different lectures and talks and new books, etc. Or if you're interested in taking a course on Whitehead on some of the things that I've been discussing today with Mike, you can go to whiteheadsuniverse.com, where I'm offering a Whitehead course on a rolling schedule throughout 2025. There's
Yes.
a couple of ways to stay in touch with me.
There are a couple ways. Yes, you are more accessible than the average scholar, and that's fantastic. All these links will be in the show notes. Yeah, again, thank you so much, Andrew, for this really enlightening and engaging conversation.
Hey, thank you, Mike.